Ha, hinikarigiwina. Ho chankrajara huwashu chwinga hingaide. Maichete rajara Danielle DeLonga hingaide. Hello, my name is Danielle DeLong, and thank you very much for taking the time to watch and listen to my final presentation for MTAG's Principles of Tribal Sovereignty. And I hope you find this informative and interesting. And without further ado, let's begin. Indian tribes, with their unique values, traditions, and tribal identities, are grounded in their practices. Historically, Indian tribes had inherent tribal sovereignty prior to their contact with colonizers. After generations of colonialism, Indian tribes are struggling to maintain their inherent sovereign rights. A closer examination of the historical and current federal tribal relationship is necessary in order to understand how tribal sovereignty has been diminished and tribal governments are working to maintain inherent sovereignty under the new federal policies that allow for tribal decision-making and self-governance. Tribal sovereignty has been threatened through generations of toxicity within the federal government. The federal government consistently intervened in tribal governments and imposed constraints on tribal sovereignty through treaties and other federal policies. Treaties were the first formal recognitions where Indian tribes and the federal government interacted on a government-to-government level. Early on, with treaty making, Indian tribes began to lose their inherent sovereignty at the hands of paternalism and colonialism. The early treaties usually involved the sale or trade of Indian lands. Because of the colonizers' ethnocentrism, they often viewed the Indians as savages who were seen as inferior to white civilization, and thus were treated as doomed to disappear. In time, the demand for more Indian lands resulted in more treaties being made which established boundaries and territories, greatly reducing Indian lands and imposing limitations on tribal self-governance. The colonists, with their familiar hierarchical European governments, adopted the concept of manifest destiny on Indian country. Treaty making became very paternalistic, with the federal government as the great white father and the Indians as the dependents. This relationship is evident with the creation of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery basically deeded land over to the first Christian to discover the territory, extinguishing the Indians from that territory by purchase or by conquering. The United States Supreme Court case of Johnson versus McIntosh essentially established Indian title, while the federal government held ultimate title. It recognized the tribal inherent sovereignty. However, self-governance was still diminished under the rule of the federal government. Another early policy, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, contains language that speaks to the federal government having a moral obligation to uphold their trust responsibility. The federal government continued to impose other policies over the next few generations, incorporating assimilation and termination, easily persuading state and local governments of their ethnocentric policies. Some of these local efforts could be seen during the Dakota Uprising with the bounties placed on Dakota men, women, and children. The despairing sentiments between the federal government and the tribes was fragile and in dire need of healing. Much of the federal authority and tribal oversight is currently handled by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. They're often ridiculed and referred to in Indian country as the new Great White Father due to the adoption of paternalism in their bureaucratic policies. One of the bureaucratic policies includes the creation of the Indian Reorganization Act, which allowed hundreds of tribal nations to create constitutions that adopted the model of the federal government. Fast forward to 1975, with the creation of the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act, which supported tribal self-government through programs and funding and essentially attempts to strengthen tribal sovereignty, fulfill treaty obligations, return and protect tribal lands, and a continued trust responsibility. This act, along with the newer Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1994, actually began to undo harms and allows tribal nations to pursue funding towards their own tribal needs. This provides for for tribal authority in decision making. Perhaps the most controversial and most prevalent situation affecting Indian country is in the Holland versus Brackeen case before the Supreme Court. One dichotomy of the guardian ward relationship was revealed in the Supreme Court oral arguments in Brackeen. One argument made in support of the Indian Child Welfare Act was the plenary power that Congress has over Indian tribes. On one hand, historically, it was good for Congress to actively legislate in this area and enact the Indian Child Welfare Act through the use of its plenary power. On the other hand, we have seen how the exercise of such federal authority can be seen as if the federal government is acting as the ward toward tribes. And it takes an approach that is too heavy-handed and controlling. This is the dichotomy, where plenary power can be used by Congress for what helps, but it can also be interpreted and applied in a manner that undermines tribal sovereignty. There is a dichotomy among Indian country where tribal nations strive towards advancing their inherent sovereign rights and try to eliminate any involvement from the federal government in tribal decision-making and enterprises. However, there is also the other hand where tribal nations rely heavily on the federal government to fulfill their trust responsibility with provisions to support tribal incentives financially with federal programs and policies. This vicious cycle is perhaps inevitable since the federal-tribal relations have been so fraught with toxicity for generations. The paternalistic relationship is still intertwined and tangled in tribal affairs. Tribes cry out, "We're sovereigns. We do what we want. Now give us money." It may not make much sense, but it's often the reality. The future relationship of the federal government and tribal governments require healing from the recurrent fractures. It's inevitable and a best practice that the individual tribal government and not the federal government, nor some Bureau of Indian Affairs employee with their own ideas on what would best serve the individual tribe. It's solely that unique tribe with its own values, traditions, and practices that is in the best position to best serve and meet the needs of their tribe. Until the federal government can understand and obey this natural law and best practice, then the complexity and conflicted relationship will remain with the federal government, diminishing the inherent sovereign powers of tribal self-governance.